I will be very quick with this presentation because we're running out of time, but I think it's very important that we consider this question: do we need an upper house in Queensland? In October, it will be a century since the vote was taken to dissolve the upper house in Queensland. A whole 100 years, and it's been pretty disastrous ever since. It is the only state in Australia that doesn't have an upper house. And so we need to ask ourselves, well, why is it so? Right, I'll go into the history and I'll go into the details of what we are dealing with now and what we could have in the future. We are the only unicameral state in Australia that has this. Just as a reminder of what Queensland is about, that is the coat of arms of Queensland. It's about the regions. It's about beef, sheep, grain, and mining. Look at those illustrations in the middle of the coat of arms. It's a very old coat of arms, but it remains the same today. The engine that drives Queensland is outside the southeast corner. That's a part of Europe that is about the same size as Queensland. Look at those countries there: France, Germany, the UK, a lot of Czechoslovakia, Austria, down into Italy, up to Denmark, parts of Sweden. That is the size of Queensland. It is a massive, massive state in Queensland. So we need to do something about governing it correctly. There are 93 state electorates in Queensland. It's the world's 6th largest subnational entity, and it's larger than all but 15 countries in the world. It's a big state. This tiny little corner with the red circle, that's where all the power lies. It's 1.2% of the size of Queensland, southeast Queensland. It has 70% of state electorates in that tiny little area, which is astonishing. Just look at that. It's almost like measles when you see that blow up of the southeast Queensland corner. Look at the dots there. And by the way, look at the concentration of the red dots in the middle around the centre of Brisbane. And if you want a good latte, there are a couple of green dots in the middle of there. So that's the area where you go for a latte, if you want to be a latte sipper. But look at the dots and the rest of the state. Very sparsely separated from everything else. So why should those little dots in that tiny corner control the rest of the state? As they do, no matter what you can say and deny it, that is what happens, particularly with the setup that we've got now. 70% there, 30% for the rest. There was an upper house in Queensland for 75 years since Queensland became a state. And I'll go quickly into the history of this. And it is a checkered history. Right from the beginning were many people who said, this is not good enough, it should change, but it never got up until some politics happened. In 1859, the colony was created. 1860, the first Queensland Parliament sat with 11 members, and this is the salient word, nominated to the Legislative Council. You had to be a property owner to vote. You had to be a property owner to be on the Legislative Council. You were nominated, never elected, right from the start. And that was a major problem. Only the squattocracy, the gentry, were the people who got into the upper house. In 1890, 30 years later, the governor's speech announces a bill to provide for an elected Legislative Council. And everybody said, hey, happy, but it never got up. Nothing ever happened with it. 1893, 1900, 1902, 1908, bills were put up to modify the power of the council. Not passed. 1915 and then 1916-17, the government of T.J. Ryan, Labor Premier, is elected in 15, introduces the bill to have the council abolished. It was all rejected by the council 3 times. 1 year after another, he kept coming at it. Always rejected. So he went to a referendum in 1917 to abolish the council, but it was soundly defeated. 60% of people said, no, we're not going to abolish the council. So he didn't win. 1918, Labor government adds 13 new members. These people, of course, would have had property, but they were Labor supporters. to the Legislative Council, and the bill to abolish the council is still defeated. Didn't have the numbers. 1919, 3 more members. That's 16 more members in the Legislative Council. And the bill to abolish it is again defeated. 1920, then it happened. Premier Red Ted Theodore. He was an avowed socialist. He was known as Red Ted because of his views, and he was successful and very, very wily. In 1920, on the 19th of February, an interim appointed Lieutenant Governor, William Lennon, who had been the Labor Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, appoints 14 more Labor members to the council. He was only Lieutenant Governor for a few weeks because the retiring governor actually appointed him because he was simply the Speaker of the House and, not a problem. And so this Lieutenant Governor was just simply a seat warmer for a few weeks until the new governor came over on the boat from England, no doubt. In that period, he appointed 14 more Labor members. That's 30 of them in the Legislative Council. Now the Labor people had the majority in the Legislative Council. In 1921, for the 5th time, Labor Party introduced the bill for the Legislative Council, and that was 24th of October. 26th of October, the council passes, just one day later, by 28-10, the second reading of a bill. Notice there were 30 Labor members appointed, but the vote was 28-10. A couple of them defected. And it's passed the second reading to abolish the council. 27th of October, 3 days after it was first introduced. The council meets for the last time, adjourning at 8:37. No doubt they went down to the pub and had a merry old time. They demolished, destroyed the upper house in Queensland because they were not getting what they wanted politically from the Legislative Council when they were in power, and they just simply wanted to get rid of them, so they would get rid of the barriers to them passing what they wanted and not have any democratic say in it. So in 1922, the next year, the actual act got up and was abolishing the Legislative Council, 1922. So next year is the centenary, but certainly the council met for the last time 100 years ago this year. Very importantly, in 1934, this is very important, the Constitution Act of Queensland is further amended by the Labor government. Legislative Council cannot be restored without a referendum. It cannot be restored by the Parliament. Got to have a referendum. That's a very important thing. Protecting themselves, but I think actually it's not a bad idea because we don't want any excesses in power from anybody. There are a number of really good articles about this, and there's a note down the bottom too. If you want to get these articles, email me for copies of them. And this article, Democracy Has Long Odds in a Stacked House. In other words, it's just not going to happen while you do not have an upper house. The Institute of Public Affairs has a very good article. It's 50 pages long, and Dr. Prasser is one of the authors. And it goes into a lot of detail about the history and also has some suggestions. So you're very welcome to read that, and I'll send that to you. And also this other article that Scott sent me by Nicola Cerrone, who was another author of that Institute of Public Affairs paper, gives 4 reasons for an upper house. Representative democracy. It is not representative unless you have equal representation throughout the whole state. And of course, that does not happen with our Legislative Assembly. Public deliberation. The public have a right to look at what is being mooted as law. It's just rushed through all the time, no matter who's in power. This is what happens. Legislative outputs. The quality of what comes with this legislation needs to be scrutinised, needs to be fine-tuned, needs to be made better. Another set of eyes will always make it better. And of course, the biggie in Queensland politics, executive accountability. There's just not enough of it. It's been very bad. The political parties' stance on this. The LNP in 1981, when the Nationals and Liberals were separate, the Nationals called for reinstatement. The Borbidge government considered a referendum, but it didn't get up. 2009 State Convention of the LNP overwhelmingly supported a referendum. But 2 years later, the LNP executive abandons the upper house push, and this was announced by the leader, Jeff Seeney, who was quite adamant that the LNP had made this decision. I don't think so. That was not made by the members of the LNP. So I think there needs to be, any investigative journalists around here need to have a little look at the sequence of events there. Now, just as a matter of interest, in 2021, this year, coming up, it's either June or July, a policy motion will be taken to State Convention to reinstate the upper house again. We'll see how it goes. I witnessed a meeting where this was put up and there was very high support for it, very little dissension. So people do want that. Then, of course, Labor, we know their stance on it. No, they are centralist power people. They do not like the idea of an upper house. And the Greens, I don't know where they stand, but I did examine their website and I saw absolutely no reference to this. All sorts of talk about democracy and accountability, all of that stuff, but nothing about specifically an upper house. So my understanding is that they too are not in support of it. So there we have on one side what you could call a conservative side, and the other side is the left that stands on this issue. Now, what happens in other states? In South Australia, they have 22 members of the upper house, but it's treated as a single electorate, just as we do in the Commonwealth when we get senators. They represent the entire state, as do the South Australian upper house people. And they have an 8-year term. 11 of them are elected every 4 years. So like half the house every 4 years. In New South Wales, 42 members of the upper house. Again, a single electorate, so you can live anywhere in the state and represent the entire state. 8-year terms, and again, 21 of them, half of them, elected every 4 years. So if you live down the bottom of New South Wales, you are still a representative for somebody up in Tweed Heads. Okay? How that works, I don't know. Victoria has 40 members, 8 electoral regions, and they have 4-year terms. So it's just every 4 years, the whole lot get elected again, as they do with the Legislative Assembly. Western Australia has 36 members, 6 electoral regions around the state, and 3 of them are in the metro area. That's where most of their population, and 3 rural. So at least it's 50-50. 4-year terms fixed for both houses, similar to a couple of other states. And Tasmania has 15 members, tiny little Tasmania. Has 15 members in their upper house, 15 electoral regions, and every one of those regions has pretty much equal population, not unlike lower house seats. They have 6-year terms. Every year they have an election for the upper house. 3 in 1 year, 2 the next, then 3, then 2. And over the 6 years, they end up with the 15 of them elected again. So they are always going every year to the polls. It gives people a job, I suppose, something to do every year. I think it's a bit overkill, but there you go. Now, the current Queensland system, we do not have an upper house. The Legislative Council chamber is now only used for ceremonial and other formal occasions. I've been to a few seminars and conferences there, such as the opening of Parliament, estimates hearings, and other committee hearings. It is run by committees. The oversight of what happens in a Legislative Assembly and what legislation is put forward is controlled by committees. And there's been quite a checkered history of that too. The history of the committees is from 1922 to 1987. It was pretty ordinary. Parliamentary committees just focused on mundane matters such as the library, the refreshment rooms, parliamentary buildings, printing, standing orders committees, housekeeping stuff. That was it. It just nothing much happened at all, right up till 1987. 1988, under then Premier Ahern. Notice this is after Joe. It's Premier Ahern by then. The Parliamentary Committee of Public Accounts became the first committee to be established by legislation in the history of Queensland. And it's followed by a Public Works Committee. So just 2 of them, But that was a start in 1988. 1989, the Fitzgerald report came out after having sat for 2 years and gone through with a fine-tooth comb a number of issues, as we well know. They recommended a comprehensive system of parliamentary committees to enhance the ability of Parliament to monitor the efficiency of government, which is a way of saying we're putting you under the microscope, or this is what we suggest we do. They further recommended that these parliamentary committees should have the power to conduct public hearings, the power to investigate and obtain information and documents. They can say to a minister, well, this is what he suggested. They say to a minister, show us what you're talking about, show us your substantiating evidence, and they're supposed to do it. That's what he suggested. The committees should accept and report on petitions and complaints, and the legislative process should allow sufficient time for the involvement of parliamentary committees, because it hadn't happened before. They just simply passed things. So this was the recommendation of Fitzgerald, and some of it's happened, some of it hasn't. From 2002, from the 3rd to the 5th of September, this is just an aside, I might add. It's not really about committees, but it's a moot point. The Queensland Parliament sat in council for the first time it sat outside Brisbane in its history. Over 1,000 people attended in the public gallery. Now tell me that the people outside Brisbane aren't interested in what goes on in government. 1,000 people turned up. They're clamouring for information, for involvement, for acknowledgement, for assistance. And they're not getting it, even with these committees. 2011, the Queensland Parliament introduced a new portfolio-based committee system and amended its legislation. Notice it's about portfolios, so it's one about education, about health, about transport, whatever, and I'll look at those in detail later. It's not about the areas that they're representing. And there's limited people on all of those committees. So only those people who aren't necessarily from an area where the thing that they're talking about resides, they're just a handful of people, and the rest of the parliamentarians do not get to see any details. So it's just a little club. There is always a majority of people in the government, but they are forced to put people from outside the government on these committees. Those people are very much hamstrung, and they are just simply railroaded. The chair is always someone from the government. In 2016, the committee system was recognised in the Constitution of Queensland, and portfolio committees were provided with the power to initiate inquiries. Very important. Within their area of responsibility only. Legislative process should include committee examination of bills. Now, you would have thought that did it before, but they've actually finally legislated for that. These committees, there are 7 of them that are portfolio committees and 3 of them are statutory. The portfolio ones are legal affairs and safety, taking care of a number of departments: justice, women, domestic, police, fire and emergency, community support and services, disability, housing, sort of all those social things in there. State Development and Regional Industries Committee, and I will revisit this. It's responsible for state development, infrastructure, local government and planning. So there is the interaction of the state government with local government through the State Development and Regional Industries Committee. And of course, fisheries, regional development, manufacturing and water, all of these things outside the southeast corner. Take note of that. The interest of what they're supposed to be looking at is outside the southeast corner. The Economics and Governance Committee takes care of the Premier and Cabinet. Massive department, massive number of staff in the Premier's department. What for? As far as I'm concerned, it's just a propaganda machine, most of it. Transport and resources, for the obvious things: transport, education, employment and training. Well, they stick together to a certain extent. Employment, I wouldn't have thought fits with that, but of course you have to be trained to be employed. Health and environment, for the obvious reasons. Health things have to all stay together. But the Great Barrier Reef is shoved in there. Health and environment, they call it, so fair enough, but okay. So there's this mishmash of departments being looked at by just 7 portfolio committees. The statutory committees, the Committee of the Legislative Assembly, essentially just looks at their parliamentary powers, their rights, their standing rules, any other matters. In other words, what they choose for it. Look down the bottom. Any matter referred to the committee by the Speaker. So it's the catch-all for what they want to have a look at and make some decisions about. The Parliamentary Crime and Corruption Committee, we hear about that very often, and the good old Ethics Committee, which is supposed to have been taken care of by the Committee of the Legislative Assembly, but they've got an entire committee to look at, are they behaving themselves? Okay? So there are 10 committees there. That's all. And they have about 6 people in each, so 60 people are the only ones who get to look at details of all of these different government departments. That's the committee system. Contrast that to an upper house where every bill that comes past goes past the desk of every member. So if you've got something to do with fisheries and you live in Cairns, you're going to take notice. If you've got something to do with the cost of lattes, you might look at it if you live in West End, okay? You've got the right, if you're in an upper house, to look right across the board at all details. The realities of what we're living with all of that in Queensland. Just have a look at the membership of this State Development and Regional Industries Committee. Look at those Southeast Queensland people. 4 of the 6 come from Southeast Queensland, around Brisbane. Robbie Catter is in North Queensland, the far northwest. There is one other outside Brisbane area, Tom Smith, Central Queensland, Bundaberg. Very nice young man, I'm sure, very sincere. Have a look at his Facebook. He looks to be very sincere and keen. And he's an ex-school teacher. What he would know about state infrastructure and development is probably minimal. He is on the Regional Industries Committee. So look at the stacking there for Southeast Queensland, making decisions for the rest of this massive state. That, as far as I'm concerned, is not good enough. And then you have a look at the things that happen when people are in power and they have unbridled power. We all know about Jojo and the way he ran things, and love him or loathe him, you've got to admit he's become famous for this phrase. Don't you worry about that. Oh, I'm not going to answer that. I'm going out to just feed you chooks. That's it. That's Jojo. So he was not held to account by committees. Note that it was only after he left that Rob Borbidge brought in the first parliamentary committees. And then, of course, mea culpa. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter what happened. It doesn't matter who did it. I will be the media tart. I'll get up there and I'll say I'm sorry, and you'll all forgive me because I've got the most adorable, gargantuan grin in the whole of history. He just got away with everything, and nobody was ever held to account for anything. He was always the spokesperson for any kind of controversy. So just glossing over, not held to account. Yeah, a lot got dumped. Yeah, a lot got dumped on her. That's exactly right. And before that, between the two of them, Goss. There's a lot about Goss. The Goss gloss. This will be coming up again. I don't know if you've heard of the Heiner affair. I don't know if you've heard of Shreddergate. But this was absolutely outrageous. And it was, the architect of it was Goss and Kevin Rudd, shredding the evidence from the Heiner affair, which investigated paedophilia in the John Oxley Centre and all other manner of really heinous crimes against children involving, from that Heiner affair, it was involving prominent citizens, including parliamentarians. They decided to shred the entire evidence. And there is a man called Kevin Lindegaard. He is fighting them. He's been fighting them for 30 years. He is a member of the Labor Party. And he is still fighting to get this information out to the public because it was a complete cover-up of really heinous crimes. To be advised what is going to happen with that one, but certainly never held to account for that Shreddergate or any other things that happened. Lots of things happened under Goss. Terry McEnroth's daughter was very closely aligned with Mr. Goss. I'll say no more. And the other side of politics, as soon as Newman got in, I think he did a great job, but I can understand that a lot of people thought too much too soon, particularly as soon as he got in, he immediately flagged plans to bypass the parliamentary committee system and just simply bring into effect his party's election promises, which is fine. It's keen, it's very military and efficient, but he hurt a lot of people. There has to be a system of checks and balances, no matter who is in power. Now, the result of that, he got thrown out in the next election, so it was too much too soon. He did it a very bad way. Then, of course, we have the woman I call the baby butcher, okay? And Nana Anna in the background. She'll keep us safe. A few years ago, when Jackie was still in Parliament, Palaszczuk handed Trad the licence to belt farmers over trees, said the Queensland Country Live. She's bowed to extreme green groups and introducing legislation which will overturn a lot of the Vegetation Management Act that was brought in by the LNP, and a lot of reforms were put in there. There was a letter sent to Jackie Trad, and it was detailing how she was going to overhaul this Vegetation Management Act. 5 pages of instructions from the WWF, the Wilderness Society, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and they detail paragraph by paragraph how Labor was going to push things through in the Parliament. Under instruction, they completely dismantled the reforms that had happened in the VMA. How are we going for time? What's the time now? 8:30. I'll have to keep going. We might have time. I welcome a Deputy Mayor of Redlands, Julie Talty. No, I might get you up later, Julie. Julie has got a story about the VMA in effect in a suburban area. And then just multiply that out by what happens in the regions. We'll just get to hear that later. Thanks, Julie. I'll get you to do that later. The VMA is a dreadful act. It is destroying people in the regions. In fact, there was growing disquiet at the time that the Palaszczuk government failed to deliver a promised roundtable discussion, consultation process before any decision was made about it. Of course they didn't. That's going through the committees. Ignored it. Just did it. Just railroaded it through. So the committees don't work. They're a disaster. Last meeting, we had a fundraiser for Professor Peter Ridge. He exposed the fraudulent science behind the decisions to do the reef regulations. 8 peers looked at that science. All of them rejected it. But what happened? When the government got it, they just simply put these reef regs through based on this completely fraudulent science. No checks and balances. No second opinions. No upper house to hold them back. Not good enough. I have a book here that Dr. Prasad sent me. He is one of the authors, Restraining Elected Dictatorship, with a number of essays on this very issue. So you're very welcome to borrow that if you would like to look at this further. So what would it look like if you did have an upper house? How would you do it? All the states are different. So how would we do it? The state electorate maps show that we have 93 state electorates. If we had, like New South Wales and South Australia, a set number for everybody representing the whole state, maybe you'd have 35 to 45 members, pretty similar number to the other states. But I would suggest, because the bulk of the population is in the southeast corner, most of you people are still going to come from the southeast corner, because it's physically difficult for someone who lives at the top of Cape York to come back and forth to Queen Street to go to the Parliament. Now, this breaking up into Queensland of regions is a very common breakup of regions, and just into 5 regions for all sorts of purposes. 5 regions are there, and 2 of them are in southeast Queensland. So the bulk are over in the rest of the regions, but they're very big. If you had 7 members in each, you'd have 35 members. 10 would be in the southeast Queensland, 25 in the regions. So the balance of power, regions against the metropolitan, goes back to the regions as opposed to what happens in the Legislative Assembly. But what about the way big departments are already set up to deliver their services over this really vast state? The Department of Education, for instance, has 7 regions that they take care of. Only 2 of them are in southeast Queensland. If they all had 5 members each, that'd be 35 members. And that would be 10 people in southeast Queensland, 25 in the regions. The thing, by looking at government departments that are already there is an infrastructure already there. There are buildings that they own. It would be a relatively simple and cost-effective process to just do a little bit of addition to those current buildings to house some members of the upper house in those buildings. So it could be Department of Education, the way they're set up with 7 regions, could be Department of Health. But they've got 15 regions, and 5 of those are in southeast Queensland. So if there were just 3 members each, there'd be 45 members. So I'm beginning to think 15 regions is too much. I think it's a bit unwieldy, but people need to look at all possibilities. Again, you have established infrastructure already there. You don't have to build new buildings or anything like that. Now, the State Development Department, the one I mentioned before, that's very interesting. It has 10 regions, just 10. If you took 4 from each region, there'd be 40 members. And the end result would be 30% of those members would be in southeast Queensland, 70% would be out in the regions. Therefore, that's reversing the percentage of power that you have in the Legislative Assembly. And that is a balancing act. Okay? Now have a look at those people that are on those lists down there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Look at the regions that are missing out on having somebody on the committee who is looking after their interests. Central Queensland, that includes Rockhampton. Darling Downs, Southwest, that's Toowoomba and all of the infrastructure that is happening out from Toowoomba. Far North Queensland, that's Cairns, Townsville, right? Mackay, the Bowen Basin with all of those mines. No representatives on the committees. And North Queensland itself, I'm sorry, that's where Cairns and Townsville would be. So they're not represented on the committees that's looking at state development. The bulk of the members are right here in southeast Queensland. There has been a suggestion made by Mr. Aidan McClendon, who was in the Katter Party, he was in the Queensland Party. He suggested sending local mayors to the Legislative Council. It will cost nothing, he said. Well, I question that. There are 77 local government areas, 77 of them. 77 travel and accommodation on a regular basis down to Brisbane, okay? If you are a mayor of one of those areas, you've got a pretty busy job being a mayor. How are you going to give attention to statewide matters? How are you going to give proper attention to your local area for which you are a mayor? You can't have efficiency with that. And it most certainly would not be cost effective. The suggestion was, you don't have to have any more infrastructure because these people are already there. But there are other implications. There are way too many of them. 77? No, I don't think so. Can you imagine the bun fights? Right? I would suggest that you keep the existing local government liaison with state development, the State Development Department, because that is their job, to liaise with a set number of local government areas within their region. They're already working with them. They already have centres and offices and conference facilities. They already travel around as a committee. I would suggest that they don't do it very often because there's not enough of them, but that state development has the buildings there, even though the people on the committee don't actually go there. Okay? So that is my suggestion, that is worthy of a forensic examination to utilise a department that is set up for the whole state, the benefit of the whole state. And of course, the benefit would be 70% in the regions, because that's what it's about, in the regions. The takeaway of all of this, remember Don Chipp, right? Left to Liberals, if you're old enough, you'll remember Don Chipp. He became famous for this: keep the bastards honest. That's what we've got to do. Keep them honest. That was actually an official motto of the Australian Democrats when they went to an election. And that is what it's about, apart from, let's look after these regions, because they are definitely not being looked after now. I spoke to a lady who was on the Shire Council in the Cooktown area, and she said Queensland is actually two regions, east of the Great Divide and west of the Great Divide. And that's where all the attention is going, east of the Great Divide, because that's where the population is. And the west of the Great Divide, it just gets ignored, even though, and again, I refer to Senator Gerard Rennick, brought out something the other day. He said, in our national anthem, we speak about our wealth for toil. In Queensland, our wealth is in our resources, in our areas. And it's out there, in the regions. It's not in the middle of West End and the latte shops. Okay, there's that email for copies of those articles again. This is just my suggestion. I was prompted to do this because I went to a meeting where it was put forward that it needs to be looked at in political parties, and I was quite taken aback with the support for that motion. There were the usual objections of, it costs too much. Well, everything costs too much. Driving a car costs too much, but it beats walking. So you've just got to be sensible, and you've got to have some balance. And we don't have it in Queensland. We have people with unbridled power doing exactly as they please, particularly now. And we're sick of it. It's been 100 years, so you can't say we haven't tried. It didn't work. So let's just look again.